a dedicated black nurse, exhausted from weeks of volunteering in disaster zones, was ready to board her flight home. But just as she approached the gate, everything took a turn. A security officer without reason singled her out, questioning her in front of everyone. Her bags were pulled apart, her credentials ignored. What happened next not only shocked the entire airport but sparked a powerful response no one expected. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter. The airport was alive with the hum of movement, the echo of hurried footsteps, the distant crackle of overhead announcements, the low murmur of conversations that floated just beneath the surface of recognition. Naomi Wells moved through this symphony with a quiet determination, her figure cutting a path through the crowded terminal. She wasn't in a rush, but there was a sense of urgency in the way her hands gripped the handles of her suitcases, too large, heavy things that rolled behind her like anchors dragging along the polished floor. They weren't just luggage, they were life-saving supplies, each item carefully packed with the intent to deliver relief to people whose lives had been shattered by forces beyond their control. Naomi's mission was simple: to get these supplies where they needed to go. But things were rarely that simple. As she approached the check-in counter, Naomi was keenly aware of the subtle shifts around her, the way the line seemed to thin just slightly, the way passengers sidestepped to avoid standing too close. These weren't grand gestures. No one spoke, no one stared for long. But Naomi felt the unspoken space they left behind. This was not unfamiliar. It was the same unspoken thing she had carried since she was a girl. Sitting quietly on city buses while others looked past her as if to say, "You're here, but not really." She reached the front of the line and met the eyes of the man behind the counter. His name tag read Jack Merrill, short sleeves rolled up just enough to suggest he was not here to play games. His gaze lingered a beat too long on her face, then dropped to the suitcases beside her. "Good afternoon," Naomi began, offering a small, polite smile. "I'm checking in for flight 3177 to Port Harbor." Jack nodded, expression unreadable as he tapped at the keyboard. His eyes flicked up again, scanning the luggage with more interest than necessary. "That's quite a load," he said. "It is," Naomi replied evenly. "These are humanitarian supplies. I have a letter of approval from your corporate office for the extra baggage." She reached into her shoulder bag, retrieving the neatly folded document. Jack didn't take it right away. His eyes narrowed just slightly, as if considering whether she was worth the trouble. After a pause that felt too long, he accepted the paper and unfolded it with deliberate care. Naomi watched him read. Or perhaps he wasn't reading, perhaps he was simply waiting long enough to make it seem as though he had. His brow furrowed, lips curling in something that stopped just short of a sneer. "This doesn't look official to me," he said, handing it back. Naomi straightened, calm but firm. "I spoke directly to the corporate office. If you need to verify it, I'm happy to wait while you make the call." Jack chuckled under his breath, the sound low and dismissive. "Ma'am, you'd be surprised how many people claim to have special permission. But rules are rules. You can pay the overage fees or leave something behind." Her grip on the paper tightened slightly, though she kept her face neutral. "I think we both know this isn't about rules." Jack's eyes snapped to hers, his smirk thinning into something colder. "Is that so?" Naomi held his gaze, refusing to blink. "It was always like this. Rules, procedures, they were tools. But tools could be wielded differently depending on whose hands held them. And when those hands belonged to someone like Jack Merrill, they became something sharper, something meant to remind people like Naomi of their place." A voice called out from the line behind her, a man shifting impatiently from one foot to the other. "Is there a problem?" Jack leaned on the counter, voice loud enough for the line to hear. "Not at all. Just taking care of some extra baggage." Naomi could feel the ripple moving down the queue. People craned their necks, subtle but unmistakable, as if waiting for the moment when she would be escorted away. Apologizing as she went, "I'm not leaving," Naomi said, voice low but unwavering. "And these supplies aren't going anywhere either." Jack's smirk flickered, but the tension that followed was thick. "Suit yourself," he said at last, tapping the phone beside him. "Security to counter 5. The words cut through the terminal like a hammer striking glass. Naomi stood still, rooted to the spot, as the line behind her shifted and murmured. She had felt this weight before in schoolrooms, in department stores, in board meetings. It was the weight of being seen and unseen at once. The kind of gaze that searched for cracks in your armor while pretending not to look at all. And yet, Naomi didn't move. Somewhere, across the room, she caught the gaze of a young boy no more than 7. Watching from a nearby bench. His small hands tugged at the sleeve of his mother's coat. "Why are they calling security on her?" he whispered. The innocence of his question slicing deeper than any insult could. His mother's eyes met Naomi's for a brief moment. An apology lingering there that would never be spoken aloud. This is the world we live in, Naomi thought, feeling the familiar ache settle in her chest. The footsteps of the approaching security officers echoed behind her. Steady and unhurried, Naomi took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come. Jack Merrill's smirk hadn't left his face. Even as Naomi Wells stood unmoving before him, there was a certain satisfaction in the way he leaned on the counter. Phone still in hand, waiting for security to arrive. Naomi could feel the terminal shifting around her. Though no one said a word. They never did. Passengers in line behind her stole glances. But the moment she turned her head, their eyes dropped to their shoes. Or the floor. Or the scrolling departures board above. That's how it always was. No one wanted to get involved. Not because they didn't know. No. They knew. They saw the way Jack's gaze had lingered too long on her bags. How his tone carried the thin veneer of polite authority stretched over something more rigid. More dangerous. They saw it but chose the comfort of distance. Letting the story unfold like a performance they had not asked to witness. Naomi wasn't performing. This wasn't theater to her. Her hands rested lightly on the handles of her suitcases. But the weight of them now seemed heavier than before. Not because of the contents. But because of what they had become, symbols of something larger. Objects onto which judgment had been projected. The footsteps of security officers drew closer. Their dark uniforms cutting through the crowd like shadows pulling free from the walls. 2 men, tall, broad, and utterly indifferent, approached the counter with the tired authority of those who had done this before and expected little resistance. "Ma'am," the taller of the two said, his voice edged with the kind of weariness that comes from being called too many times for too many reasons that didn't seem to warrant it. "Is there a problem here?" Jack spoke before Naomi could answer. "She's refusing to comply with baggage limits," he said, his voice a shade too smug. "I've explained the rules, but she insists on making this difficult." Naomi didn't flinch. She met the officer's gaze head on. "These aren't personal belongings," she said, her voice steady but firm. "They're humanitarian supplies, approved by the corporate office. I have the documentation right here." She held out the paper again. The officer accepted it, his eyes skimming over the lines of text with mechanical efficiency. His partner, shorter and with sharper eyes, stood behind him, watching Naomi as if waiting for something for her to lose her composure. Perhaps, or to step out of line. "Everything seems in order," the officer said after a long pause. Jack's smirk faded, replaced by something closer to irritation. "You're just going to take her word for it?" Jack snapped. "Come on, you know how this goes. I've been here long enough to know when someone's trying to play the system." The officer's gaze flicked toward Jack, and for a moment, the tension seemed to shift. But it didn't break. Jack's words hung there, thick and unmoving, stretching out between them like invisible barbed wire. It was subtle the way he said someone, the way his lips curled around it like it meant something more. Naomi caught it. The officer did too, though his face gave nothing away. The air grew heavier. "I'm not trying to play anything," Naomi said, each word deliberate. "I've followed the procedures. I've done everything I was supposed to do." Jack snorted under his breath. But Naomi pressed on. "You can call the corporate office if you like. They'll confirm it." For a moment, silence stretched between them, each second an unspoken challenge. The officer seemed to consider it. His eyes moved from Jack to Naomi, and finally to the bags at her side, bags that, for all their weight, seemed suddenly fragile under the pressure of so many assumptions. Behind Naomi, a voice whispered, soft, but loud enough to catch her ear. "Why doesn't she just pay the fee like everyone else?" She didn't turn. She knew that voice. She'd heard it 100 times before in grocery stores, in boardrooms, in parking lots. It was the voice of those who believed that fairness was doled out like rations, and that any exception for someone else was an erosion of their own share. Jack leaned against the counter, arms crossed now. He wasn't in a hurry to move the line along. Naomi could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. This wasn't about luggage. It was never about luggage. The officer sighed, returning the paper to Naomi. "You're clear," he said, his voice neutral. Jack stiffened, but he said nothing. Naomi didn't thank the officer. There was no reason to thank someone for allowing her to stand where she already belonged. As she stepped forward, moving toward the security checkpoint, the hum of the terminal seemed to return to normal. But Naomi knew better. Somewhere, a man in line would tell his wife later how difficult that woman at the counter had been. A security officer would return to his post and forget this moment by the end of his shift. And Jack Merrill would be here tomorrow, behind this same counter, with that same smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. Naomi knew this wasn't the end. But she wasn't leaving her bags behind. Naomi's heels echoed against the polished floor as she walked toward the security checkpoint, her grip tightening around the handle of her suitcase. The paper Jack had dismissed was folded neatly in her jacket pocket. But it felt heavier now, heavier than the clothes, the supplies, the blankets she carried. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a reminder. The line at security was long but orderly, snaking through metal barriers in soft, shuffling waves. Naomi stepped into place, letting the routine take over the slow advance. The rustle of plastic bins being shuffled onto conveyor belts. A man in a dark coat stood ahead of her, rocking on his heels with the impatience of someone used to breezing through these kinds of things. Behind her, a family, 2 children tugging on their mother's sleeve, asking when they'd board. Naomi's breath slowed. She had done this before. But there was something about today that wouldn't shake loose. The officer at the front of the line, a woman, tall with a sharp gaze that scanned the crowd like she was reading more than boarding passes, called for the next passenger. The man in front of Naomi stepped forward, offering a smile as he handed over his ID. The officer barely looked at him, waving him through with a flick of her wrist. Naomi's turn. The officer's gaze shifted as soon as Naomi placed her ID and boarding pass on the counter. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, the way people's faces do when they're trying to hide that they're doing it. "Step to the side, please," the officer said. Her voice was calm, but Naomi heard the edge beneath it. Naomi paused. She glanced at the man in the dark coat, now already gathering his belongings from the scanner. "Is there an issue?" Naomi asked, though she already knew the answer. "Random screening," the officer replied, nodding toward the far corner where another guard waited. Naomi didn't argue. There was no point. She stepped to the side as instructed, pulling her bags with her. She didn't miss the glance the officer exchanged with her colleague, a quick, silent exchange that passed so easily, as if it had been practiced 100 times. Naomi stood still, the hum of the airport muffled in her ears. The other guard, a man with a stern jawline and the bored expression of someone working an extra shift, began unzipping her suitcase. He pulled out the first item, a stack of folded blankets, still wrapped in plastic. "What's all this?" he asked, lifting one bundle in the air as if it might conceal something. "Disaster relief," Naomi replied, keeping her voice even. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Not yet." Next came the medical supplies, first aid kits, sealed and labeled. He inspected each one with the same slow deliberation. And Naomi stood there, watching him dismantle her bags piece by piece. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the woman at the counter had turned her attention back to the line, waving through the next family with barely a glance at their belongings. This wasn't random. It never was. The guard pulled out the final item, a stack of handwritten notes from the organization Naomi worked with, detailing the supplies and their destination. "You got paperwork for this?" he asked, flipping through the pages like they might suddenly reveal something nefarious. "I do," Naomi replied, reaching into her jacket to produce the same folded document she had shown Jack. The guard took it, glancing over the page with a shrug. He handed it back without a word. By the time Naomi was allowed to repack her bags, the line at security had thinned, and the man in the dark coat was already long gone. She zipped her suitcase carefully, feeling each tug of the zipper like an act of defiance. As she lifted the bags onto the conveyor belt, she felt a small presence beside her. The boy from earlier, the one who had been tugging on his mother's sleeve, stood quietly nearby. His mother was still ahead, walking toward the next terminal, but he had lingered. His wide eyes met Naomi's. Why did they check your bags but not ours? He asked. His voice soft and curious. Naomi crouched slightly, leveling her gaze with his. Sometimes, she said gently, people see things they don't understand. And when they don't understand, they look harder. The boy frowned. But you didn't do anything wrong. Naomi smiled faintly. I know. And now you know, too. The boy seemed to consider this. Behind him, his mother called his name. He glanced over his shoulder but hesitated. Looking back at Naomi. Are you helping people? He asked. Yes, Naomi said simply. The boy nodded, as if that was all the answer he needed. He ran to catch up with his mother. And Naomi watched them disappear into the crowd. She exhaled, gathering the last of her things. She had learned long ago that it wasn't the loud moments, the slurs, the shouts that left the deepest scars. It was these small things. The subtle glances, the unnecessary delays, the way assumptions hung in the air like invisible threads, pulling at the edges of her existence. It was the weight of the almosts. Almost turned away, almost accused, almost dismissed. And still, she carried it forward. As Naomi walked toward her gate, she knew one thing with certainty. She wasn't carrying that weight alone. Naomi Wells arrived at the gate with time to spare. But the weight of the security check still pressed against her like a stone lodged beneath the skin. She placed her bags at her feet and lowered herself into the nearest chair by the window. Watching as planes taxied lazily against the backdrop of a sky fading into the soft amber of late afternoon. She had made it this far. But she knew better than to mistake progress for peace. Across the waiting area, Naomi caught sight of Jack Merrill. He wasn't working the gate, but he lingered near the boarding desk, speaking to another agent in hushed tones. His eyes flicked toward her more than once, and though he smiled as he spoke, Naomi could feel the undercurrent beneath it. Jack wasn't finished. Naomi had seen men like him before, men who held their authority in fragile hands, gripping it tighter whenever someone like her refused to shrink beneath it. Her phone vibrated. A message from Cameron, her assistant at the foundation. Everything's ready on our end. Just get those supplies here safely. Naomi typed a quick reply, short, polite, masking the storm still brewing beneath the surface. She glanced back at Jack. He had moved behind the counter, pretending to check something on the screen. But Naomi could feel his gaze settle just long enough to register his intent. He was waiting for an opportunity. And as the final boarding call approached, Naomi knew she wouldn't have to wait long. The line formed slowly, inching forward as passengers handed over their tickets one by one. Naomi held her boarding pass between two fingers, staring at it like it might slip through the cracks if she wasn't careful. When she reached the counter, Jack stepped forward without ceremony, extending his hand. "I'll take that," he said, his voice neutral but tight. Naomi handed over the pass without a word, watching as he scanned it with deliberate slowness. The beep of the scanner was immediate, but Jack's eyes lingered on the screen as if he were searching for something else. Something hidden beneath the surface. "Ma'am," he said, tilting his head slightly, "I'm going to need you to step aside for additional verification." Naomi raised an eyebrow, though she wasn't surprised. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "Just a routine check," Jack replied, smiling faintly. "Won't take long." The line behind her shifted. People muttered under their breath, shuffling their bags as they waited for Naomi to move. She didn't. Not immediately. Naomi kept her eyes on Jack, watching for the flicker of satisfaction that crossed his face when she finally stepped aside. The same two security officers from earlier appeared, as if summoned by an unspoken agreement. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Naomi asked, folding her arms. Jack's smile thinned. "Just making sure everything's in order." "Everything was in order at check-in," Naomi replied, her voice even but sharp enough to cut. The taller officer cleared his throat awkwardly, casting a glance at Jack before turning to Naomi. "Ma'am, if you'd follow us, we'll sort this out quickly." Naomi held her ground for a breath longer than necessary. She could hear the whispers ripple behind her, fragmented pieces of conversation just loud enough to reach her ears. What is it now? She must have done something. People like that always make things complicated. The words weren't new, but their weight hadn't lessened with time. Naomi finally moved, letting the officers lead her away from the boarding area. As she walked, she caught sight of the boy from earlier, his wide eyes following her as his mother pulled him gently by the hand. That gaze. It wasn't judgment, nor was it curiosity. It was something quieter, something Naomi recognized all too well: the fragile, unformed understanding of a child seeing injustice for the first time and not knowing how to name it. In the small, sterile room behind the gate, Naomi placed her bags on the table and stepped back. The officers moved without urgency, as if this too were routine: the slow unfolding of zippers, the quiet rustle of clothing being shifted, medical kits opened and inspected. "This really isn't necessary," Naomi said, her tone measured but unyielding. "We're just following protocol," the shorter officer replied, though his eyes didn't quite meet hers. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "No, you're not. We both know that." Silence filled the room, heavy as stone. The officer's hands hesitated over the supplies, but the taller one kept searching, pulling out every item as if something illegal might slip between his fingers if he wasn't careful. But nothing did. There was nothing to find. Naomi's eyes drifted to the clock on the wall. The plane would begin taxiing soon. She felt the shift, the slow realization settling over the officers that they had nothing to hold her for. And yet, Jack waited outside. When the search was finished, Naomi began repacking her bags, moving with deliberate calm as if each fold of clothing was an act of defiance. The taller officer stepped aside, clearing his throat once more. "You're free to board, ma'am." Naomi didn't thank him. She didn't need to. By the time she returned to the gate, most passengers were already seated, their heads bowed over phones or pressed against the cold glass of the windows. Jack stood near the entrance to the jet bridge, watching as Naomi approached. He didn't speak, but there was something victorious in the way he held himself, as if the simple inconvenience of pulling her aside had been reward enough. Naomi held her boarding pass tightly between her fingers, meeting Jack's gaze without blinking. As she passed him, her voice was low, but clear enough for him alone to hear. "You may not know me, Jack, but I know exactly who you are." Jack's smile faltered, the cracks small but visible. Naomi didn't look back. She stepped onto the plane, her bags in tow, and disappeared down the aisle, leaving Jack standing at the gate, his smirk fading beneath the hum of engines preparing to carry her far beyond his reach. The hum of the aircraft pressed softly against Naomi's ears as she settled into her seat. The cabin around her filled with the quiet rustling of passengers buckling belts and flipping through safety cards they wouldn't read. Naomi's hands rested lightly on her lap, but the tension in her fingers betrayed the calm she tried to project. The narrow space of the plane felt smaller than usual, as if Jack's lingering smirk had somehow boarded with her, taking the seat beside her in silence. She glanced out the window. The tarmac stretched endlessly, reflecting the dying light of the day. But she wasn't looking for anything in particular. A voice broke through the soft murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me." Naomi turned. It was the mother from the security line, the same woman whose little boy had watched Naomi's bags torn apart like they contained something dangerous. The woman stood quietly in the aisle, one hand resting on the back of the seat in front of Naomi's. "I just wanted to say," she began, glancing briefly over her shoulder. "I saw what happened back there. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Naomi offered a polite nod, the weight of exhaustion settling into her shoulders. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, as if waiting for permission to continue. "My son, he asked me why they treated you differently." Naomi met her eyes, soft but steady. "And what did you tell him?" The woman shifted slightly, lowering her voice to avoid the ears of nearby passengers. "I told him the truth." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line, unreadable but knowing. The woman lingered for a moment longer, then returned to her seat. Naomi stared ahead, watching as the flight attendants made their final rounds, their polished smiles and rehearsed greetings moving like clockwork. And yet, beneath the surface, just below the hum of routine, Naomi could feel it. The quiet weight of eyes. Not hostile, not aggressive, but curious in that particular way people become when they witness something unjust but lack the words to name it. She could feel it in the sideways glances from passengers who had watched her be pulled aside. The way their heads dipped slightly when she caught them looking, as if to say, "I didn't see anything," even though they had. It was a strange thing. Naomi thought how silence could speak louder than any accusation. The plane lifted into the sky with a steady roar, the city below shrinking until it was nothing more than a mosaic of flickering lights stretching toward the horizon. Naomi leaned her head against the window. But rest didn't come. Instead, Her mind wandered back to the terminal. To Jack's smirk. To the small boy whose eyes had followed her like a question left unanswered. She wondered if he would remember this years from now. If this moment, this seemingly small encounter, would stay with him the way similar moments had stayed with Naomi. She remembered being his age. Sitting beside her own mother on buses where men looked at them just a little too long. Where store clerks lingered near aisles they didn't need to be in. No one had ever shouted. No one had ever raised a hand. But Naomi had learned early that there were ways to make people feel unwelcome without ever saying a word. The quiet dismissal. The casual oversight. The extra check at security. Small things, but not small at all. An hour into the flight, Naomi rose from her seat, stretching her legs as she made her way toward the back of the plane. Near the galley, she found herself face to face with one of the flight attendants, a young man with kind eyes who smiled warmly as she approached. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice soft but genuine. Naomi nodded, offering a faint smile in return. As she turned to head back to her seat, his voice stopped her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, stepping closer, "I just wanted to let you know. I overheard what happened at the gate." Naomi's brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, letting him continue. We see things like that more often than we'd like to admit," he said, his gaze dropping for a moment as if ashamed by the confession. "A lot of us just try not to get involved." Naomi's smile faded, but there was no malice in her expression, only recognition. "I understand," she replied, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. The flight attendant hesitated. "I guess I just wanted to say that not everyone agrees with how things are done. Some of us notice." Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. "Noticing," she said finally, her voice soft but unwavering. "Is a start." He nodded, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who knew that noticing, on its own, was rarely enough. As Naomi returned to her seat, the plane dipped slightly, the soft jolt pulling her from her thoughts. She looked out the window again, watching as the sky darkened, the horizon dissolving into the vast, quiet stretch of night. In the seat beside her, her bags rested undisturbed, as ordinary as any other luggage on the plane. But Naomi knew better. To Jack, to the officers, to the strangers in line who watched but said nothing, those bags had been anything but ordinary. They had been symbols. Symbols of how quickly suspicion could be cast. How easily someone could be made to feel like a guest in their own country. And yet, they were still here, packed with supplies that would reach the hands they were meant for. No matter how many checkpoints stood in the way. Naomi leaned back, exhaling slowly. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But the plane carried her forward. Through the night, as if to remind her that the weight she carried, though heavy, had never been hers alone. The plane touched down with the soft jolt that always marked the return to solid ground. But Naomi Wells knew the turbulence wasn't over. The hum of the engines was fading. The seatbelt sign extinguished. Yet the quiet war she had been waging, the one she carried from terminal to terminal, pressed against her ribs as if it had followed her down from the clouds. Passengers began standing, reaching for their belongings in the overhead bins with the casualness of people for whom travel was uncomplicated. Naomi stayed seated, watching as the line shuffled forward. She was in no hurry. Her gaze drifted across the faces moving past her, the same faces from the waiting area. From the security line, some glanced her way, offering brief, polite nods. Others avoided her entirely, as if unwilling to acknowledge her existence in this narrow space they all shared. And then, there was the boy. He spotted her almost immediately, tugging at his mother's sleeve as they moved toward the exit. His mother glanced down, whispering something Naomi couldn't hear. But the boy kept looking over his shoulder until the two of them disappeared through the open door. Naomi sighed, unbuckling her seatbelt at last. As she reached for her bag, a shadow crossed the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice said. Naomi turned, facing a uniformed customs officer standing just outside the jet bridge. He held a clipboard in his left hand, his right hand resting casually on the holster at his side, not out of necessity, but out of habit. "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment." Naomi met his gaze without flinching. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The secondary screening room at the small international terminal was sterile, lit by unforgiving fluorescent lights that seemed to flatten everything beneath them. Naomi sat with her back straight, her suitcase at her feet. The room was empty except for her and the officer, who was typing something into the computer with slow, deliberate keystrokes. It wasn't the room itself that felt heavy. It was the questions hanging in the air, unspoken, yet deafening. The officer finally looked up. Traveling alone? Yes. Business or personal? Neither. Naomi replied. Humanitarian aid. The officer leaned back slightly, studying her as if she had answered in a foreign language. Aid? I work with a non-profit. Naomi explained calmly. We provide relief to communities recovering from natural disasters. The supplies I'm carrying are part of that effort. He nodded, though Naomi sensed his skepticism. Mind if I take another look at those bags? Naomi's jaw tightened, but she nodded, standing as the officer stepped around the desk. He unzipped the suitcase with slow precision, lifting the same bundles of blankets, medical kits, and canned goods that had been examined at security as if they had somehow transformed during the flight. Do you have paperwork for these? Naomi reached into her jacket, producing the now creased document that had accompanied her from the start. The officer read it in silence, then held it to the light, as though fraud could be detected by the tilt of a page. You know, he said casually, still inspecting the paper, we've seen a lot of scams lately. People say they're carrying donations, but it turns out to be something else entirely. Naomi's lips pressed together. Is that what you think this is? She asked, her voice low but unwavering. The officer lowered the paper, meeting her gaze for the first time since she entered the room. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. A long pause followed. It wasn't hostility that filled the space between them, it was something quieter, more insidious. The officer wasn't angry. He wasn't confrontational. But Naomi recognized the shape of this exchange, the subtle way doubt was cast. The way suspicion lingered around people who looked like her, even when the facts were laid bare. It's just protocol, he said finally, folding the paper and handing it back. Naomi accepted it without a word, returning it carefully to her jacket pocket. As the officer zipped her suitcase, his movements were slower, not out of caution, but as if reconsidering the necessity of this entire interaction. You're free to go, he said, stepping back. Naomi secured the handle of her suitcase and moved toward the door. Before she reached it, his voice stopped her. Ma'am, he said softly. Naomi turned, waiting. He hesitated, his hand resting on the desk. I appreciate what you're doing. The aid work, I mean. Naomi studied him for a long moment. Do you? She asked. The officer opened his mouth, but no response came. Naomi didn't wait. She pushed open the door, stepping out into the terminal where travelers bustled through customs, reclaiming their belongings without interruption. Outside the airport, the air was warm and thick, heavy with the distant promise of rain. Naomi stood beneath the awning, watching taxis pull in and out, the city stretching beyond the glass doors like an unfamiliar landscape. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. A message from Cameron lit up the screen. We'll meet you at the dock tomorrow. Safe travels. Naomi typed a short reply and slipped the phone away, her eyes lingering on the horizon. The officer's words still echoed in her mind, not because of what he said, but because of what he hadn't. It was a different kind of border Naomi had crossed, one not marked by customs checkpoints or metal detectors, but by the quiet, relentless questioning that followed her wherever she went. A border that had no lines, no maps. A border that could not be escaped by plane, by train, or by car. She lifted her bag and stepped toward the curb. The weight of it no longer surprised her. It was a weight she had carried long before she ever stepped into an airport. Naomi Wells moved through the streets of Port Harbor with the quiet resolve of someone who knew better than to draw attention to herself. She had walked streets like these before, streets that smiled on tourists but watched locals with suspicion. Streets where doors opened easily for some but hesitated to budge for others. The city wore its contradictions like an old coat, one that had been patched so many times the original fabric could hardly be seen beneath the stitches. The port hummed with industry, ships moving in and out like clockwork, while just a few blocks away, entire neighborhoods sat quiet, forgotten by the same machine that powered the city's wealth. Naomi wasn't here to sightsee. Her cab dropped her at the edge of the dockyard, where Cameron, her assistant, stood waiting. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over stacked crates and weathered shipping containers. Cameron waved. Naomi, you made it. She smiled faintly. but the weariness in her shoulders betrayed her. I did. Cameron's eyes narrowed as she took in Naomi's expression. Rough flight? Rough airport, Naomi replied. Cameron nodded knowingly, but didn't ask for details. She knew better. Everything's ready, Cameron said as they walked toward a modest cargo ship docked along the pier. The supplies will be loaded tonight, and we'll head out first thing in the morning. Naomi exhaled. The tension in her chest loosened, but only slightly. As they approached the loading zone, Naomi caught sight of a man standing near the entrance. Clipboard in hand, his shirt bore the logo of the shipping company. But his eyes, narrowed and watchful, belonged to someone who didn't care for paperwork. Morning, Cameron said politely. We're here for the relief shipment. The man's gaze flicked to Naomi, lingering a second longer than necessary. You're with her? He asked Cameron, ignoring Naomi entirely. Cameron's expression stiffened. Yes, we're with the Foundation. The man shifted slightly, his grip on the clipboard tightening. I'm going to need to see some ID. Cameron blinked. I just showed my ID to the dock supervisor. Yeah, well, the man said, his gaze drifting back to Naomi. Let's see it again. Naomi stepped forward before Cameron could respond. I'll show you mine, Naomi said, already reaching into her bag. The man didn't react, but the air between them thickened. Naomi handed him her identification, her fingers steady but cold against the plastic. The man studied it longer than necessary, flipping it as if the back might reveal something different than the front. What exactly is it you're looking for? Naomi asked, her voice quiet but edged with steel. The man looked up, something unreadable flickering across his face. Just doing my job, he muttered, handing the ID back. Naomi took it without breaking eye contact. She had seen men like him before, men who wrapped themselves in the illusion of authority. Men who mistook compliance for deference. Your job, Naomi said slowly, is to make sure these supplies get where they need to go. Unless I've missed something? The man shifted, opening his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came. Cameron crossed her arms, waiting. Finally, he stepped aside. You can load the supplies, he said, though the reluctance in his voice made it sound more like a concession than a command. Naomi didn't thank him. Instead, she passed him with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every checkpoint. Every gate, every doorway that tried to close itself in her path. The sun dipped below the horizon as Naomi stood at the railing, watching the city lights flicker to life across the harbor. Cameron joined her, handing over a cup of coffee. You ever get tired of it? Cameron asked softly, leaning against the rail. Naomi sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth sink into her chest. Tired of what? Naomi replied, though she already knew the answer. Cameron gestured toward the dock behind them. Of this, of having to prove yourself to people who've already made up their minds. Naomi let the question hang in the air. Getting tired, Naomi said finally, is a luxury I can't afford. Cameron nodded slowly, as if turning the words over in her mind. But sometimes, Naomi added, her voice softer now, I do wonder what it would feel like to walk through a door without wondering if it was meant to close before I arrived. Cameron said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than words. Later that night, as Naomi lay in her small cabin aboard the ship, the events of the day settled heavily over her. She thought of the man at the dock, of the officer at the airport, of Jack's lingering smirk. None of them had raised their voices. None of them had called her names. But Naomi knew racism didn't always announce itself loudly. More often, it slipped quietly into the room, wrapped in procedure and policy, disguised as protocol and professionalism. It was the extra glance at her ID, the second check of her bags, the hand that always hovered just above the holster. Small things, but not small at all. Naomi turned over, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling in the dark. She thought of the boy in the airport, his wide eyes full of questions his mother couldn't fully answer. Maybe, she thought, that was the beginning of something, a crack in the wall that men like Jack had spent their lives building. And cracks, no matter how small, always grew. Naomi closed her eyes. She wasn't finished yet. The ship rocked gently beneath Naomi Wells as dawn stretched its quiet hand over the horizon. The soft light crept through the small, round window of her cabin, painting long shadows across the floor. She rose slowly, feet bare against the cold metal, and leaned against the window's edge. Port Harbor was behind them now, shrinking into the distance like a memory that refused to fade. Ahead lay the open sea, calm, indifferent, free of checkpoints or barriers. But Naomi knew better than to think she had left it all behind. Racism had a way of following you, even into places where no walls had been built. It slipped into quiet corners, rested in the hands of those who held power, and whispered through the cracks of every institution designed to say this far. No further. The weight of it lived in her bones. A knock at her door broke the silence. "Come in," Naomi called softly. Cameron stepped inside, her hair still damp from the morning air. She carried a small notebook tucked under her arm, the corners frayed from too many trips. "We should arrive by noon," Cameron said, setting the notebook on the desk. "They'll be waiting at the dock to unload the supplies." Naomi nodded, but Cameron lingered, shifting slightly where she stood. Naomi turned. "What is it?" Cameron hesitated. "It's nothing, really. Just," she trailed off, running a hand over the back of her neck. "I was thinking about the dock supervisor. The way he looked at you. I know you're used to it, I mean. I know we're all used to it, but there's something else about it lately." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Cameron frowned, searching for the words. "It feels like they're bolder now. Like the lines they used to hide behind are fading. And they don't care if you see them anymore." Naomi didn't answer right away. She traced a finger along the edge of the window, feeling the cold press against her skin. "Maybe the lines aren't fading," Naomi said quietly. "Maybe we're just seeing them for what they've always been." Cameron leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "And what do we do with that?" Naomi looked at her, meeting her gaze with the kind of quiet certainty that had carried her through terminals, checkpoints, and locked doors. "We keep moving," Naomi said simply. Cameron nodded, but Naomi could see the weight behind her eyes, the same weight Naomi herself carried every day. By the time they reached the next dock, the port was already alive with activity. Cranes groaned overhead, lowering crates onto rusted platforms, while workers moved like shadows between towering stacks of cargo. Naomi watched from the ship's deck as the team began unloading their supplies. A man in a navy uniform waited at the end of the gangway, clipboard in hand. He was older, his skin tanned from years under the sun, but his posture was rigid, the kind of posture Naomi recognized immediately. Authority. Naomi and Cameron stepped onto the dock together. Approaching the man, "You're with the Foundation?" he asked without looking up, eyes fixed on the clipboard. "Yes," Naomi replied. "The shipment is for the relief center just outside the city." The man nodded slowly, flipping a page. His eyes scanned the list. But something about the way he lingered over the names felt too deliberate. "This list says 50 crates," he said, glancing up for the first time. His eyes found Naomi immediately, settling there as if she were the only one standing in front of him. "I count 49. Naomi frowned. "They were all loaded this morning." "Well, they aren't all here now." Cameron stepped forward, her voice firm. "We personally oversaw the loading. I assure you, everything was accounted for." The man's gaze flicked briefly to Cameron, then returned to Naomi. "You're welcome to double-check," he said with the kind of indifference Naomi had come to expect. "But if something's missing, we'll need to file a report. Could take a few days to sort out." Naomi held his gaze, the air tightening between them. She had seen this tactic before: delay, redirect, obstruct. It was never outright refusal. That would be too obvious, too easy to challenge. But if they could make you wait long enough, they hoped you'd give up. Cameron shifted beside her, but Naomi lifted a hand, stopping her before she could speak. "Let's check the crates," Naomi said calmly. Cameron hesitated but nodded, following Naomi toward the stacks of cargo. They walked in silence, weaving through the maze of crates marked with the Foundation's logo. One by one, they counted the numbers lining up exactly as they should. But Naomi wasn't counting crates. She was counting the seconds, the long stretch of time that separated confrontation from resolution. As they reached the final crate, Naomi turned to find the dock supervisor watching them from a distance. He leaned against the railing, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, his gaze unreadable. Naomi locked eyes with him. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, until the space between them evaporated. "All 50 crates," Naomi said quietly, "just like the list says." The man straightened, eyes narrowing. "Must have miscounted," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Naomi didn't respond. Instead, She let the silence stretch between them, filling the air with the weight of what hadn't been said, the invisible ledger of assumptions, delays, and mistrust that had followed her across every border. Finally, the man turned away, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared into the maze of shipping containers. Cameron appeared beside Naomi, shaking her head. "I can't stand men like him." Naomi's gaze lingered on the empty space where the supervisor had stood. "They're not the problem," Naomi said softly. Cameron frowned. "What do you mean?" Naomi exhaled, watching the crates being loaded onto trucks for delivery. "The problem," Naomi said, "is the silence that lets them get away with it." Cameron followed Naomi's gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she, too, could now see the shape of something that had been hidden in plain sight. "We'll make sure the supplies get there," Cameron said. Naomi nodded. "Yes," she replied, "we will." The ship's horn sounded in the distance, but Naomi barely noticed. She was already thinking of the next dock, the next checkpoint, the next quiet hand that would try and fail to hold her back.